Well, thank you everyone so much for joining me today virtually. I'm really excited to share with you some of the work that I'm doing as a part of my research at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. So before I dive into salt marshes and the main topic of my talk, I thought it might be important to give you a brief background on who I am and how I got here today. So I am from a very small Northern California town called Yuba City. You can see where this gold star is. And Yuba City is maybe best known for being home to the nation's smallest mountain range, the Sutter Buttes. If you happen to also be a dried fruits fan, Yuba City is also home to Sunsweet Dried Fruits. That is where their packing plant and their headquarters are located. So despite being about 3.5 hours from the ocean, I always knew I wanted to be a marine biologist. So when I graduated high school, I moved to Miami, Florida, and pursued a bachelor's degree at Florida International University in marine biology. And it was here that I really got my first taste of marine science research. So while I was an undergrad, I was able to work on another Ph.D. candidate's research focused on the upside down jellyfish and how it interacted with seagrass beds. So after I finished my studies at FIU, I then became a benthic ecology intern at Mote Marine Lab in Sarasota, Florida. Following that, I became a seagrass lab manager at Florida Gulf Coast University for a brief stint. And while I was at FGCU, I decided it was time to go to grad school. And so I moved back to California and pursued a master's in marine science at the Estuary and Ocean Science Center at San Francisco State University. Here is my obligatory Golden Gate Bridge photo. It was a beautiful place to live. But while I was here, my science really focused on how temperature and salinity impacted submerged aquatic vegetation or underwater plants, and how that ultimately helped shape their interactions with herbivores. So you can kind of sense the theme emerging here. After I finished my master's degree, I then began work at Virginia Institute of Marine Science here in Virginia. And of course, my work here is mostly focused in salt marshes. My evolution as a scientist, though, has really taken me from underwater seagrass beds into lakes to work with things like western pond turtles, you can see pictured here. I also worked in very shallow ponds on other aquatic vegetation. And now I ultimately find myself in an almost terrestrial environment working in salt marshes. So despite this evolution, really my common research theme is aquatic plants. So I would consider myself a plant person, and I like to think about my science from the viewpoint of the plant, as my advisor would like to say. And of course, today I'll be sharing a bit more about my research in salt marshes specifically. So what is a salt marsh? I'd like to take you through this brief drone video of a salt marsh that I work in on the eastern shore of Virginia. So as we go through or above this salt marsh, I want you to imagine standing in the middle of this open intertidal grassland. You're surrounded by lush green plants. You hear birds calling in the background. Fiddler crabs are scuttling underfoot, and the tide is slowly coming in and out. This is the salt marsh. And I would say that we're really lucky that we flew over the salt marsh, because typically when you work in it, you'll often come out looking a lot like this. But all jokes aside, the marsh is a beautiful and really special place to work. It's also a critical ecosystem for the health of our economy and our landscape. So if you were to ever venture into a salt marsh, there are a couple common critters that you may see. There are several different species of fiddler crabs, but the main one you might see is the mud fiddler crab pictured here. You may also see a series of ribbed mussels poking out from the sediment. And of course, our good friend, the blue crab. If you look really hard, you may see some coffee bean snails and what we often love to eat, the eastern oyster. If you dig into the sediments a bit, you may also see what I will call infauna. This is a really broad category, and much to the chagrin of my advisor and maybe some of my lab mates, I'm bulking it all together. But this is really a series of worms and amphipods and other critters that live just below the sediment surface. You may also see the marsh periwinkle crawling around on some plant stems, and the purple marsh crab scuttling in and out of its burrows. And of course, both of these I'll be speaking to a little bit further on. And salt marshes, again, are a really common ecosystem in our area especially. But if you look at this map, All of the green lines that you see along these coasts of both the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico are salt marshes. And this widespread geographic distribution really makes these marshes a focal point of our landscapes. And for the rest of my talk today, I'll really be focusing on the salt marshes of the Chesapeake Bay. So salt marshes occur at the really unique interface where the land meets the sea. And so this is a photograph from the artist at Altitude Gallery in Cape Charles. And this photo I love. It's of Willis Wharf on the eastern shore of Virginia. And I think it really illustrates that point. So if you look closely, you can see a series of aquaculture buildings and homes that are all basically on top of the salt marsh. So really, the marsh is that true buffer and the only thing separating this entire community from the ocean. And so when we think about the marsh for the rest of my talk, I'd really like you to keep that in mind, that the marsh is the true buffer between the ocean and us. I once had another researcher phrase it to me as marshes are where the ocean touch people and where people touch the ocean. Because of their proximity to our communities, we really are relying on salt marshes for a variety of important services. This can include things like storm and flood protection, and they also provide really critical nursery habitat for a series of organisms like juvenile blue crabs or oysters. And of course, that's beneficial for our oceans and our food webs, but it also contributes to our economy through aquaculture and commercial fisheries. Salt marshes are threatened by climate change in two really unique and distinct ways. The first is through more intense storms and more frequent storms. So with these storms, we expect to see higher wave intensity, which would be responsible for increasing erosion, or the process by which the marsh falls into the water. Marshes are also threatened by sea level rise. So because of that unique position at the land-sea interface, we expect that as sea levels rise, marshes must find ways to keep pace or outpace sea level to avoid drowning. So how are these marshes keeping pace with sea level rise? Well, one way is through, or the main way is through their plants. So salt marsh plants are ultimately responsible for protecting the marsh from sea level rise. We refer to salt marsh plants as foundation species, meaning that without them, the salt marsh simply doesn't exist. And when I say plants, in this instance, for many of our Virginia salt marshes, I'm speaking about one plant in particular that makes up this lush green marsh that you see here. This one plant is called the smooth cordgrass, Spartina alterniflora. You'll hear me refer to it as Spartina for the rest of my talk today. And Spartina reproduces or grows in two unique ways. The first is above ground. It produces flowers and seeds and can disperse that way. But the main way that Spartina grows is clonally below ground. So if we think about the sediment surface occurring right about here, this single Spartina plant produces rhizomes or runners, these pink stems that grow below ground, and ultimately produces new Spartina plants from every single one of those rhizomes. And this is really the main way in which Spartina keeps our marshes vegetated. And it's important to note that both the above ground parts of Spartina and those below ground parts are critical in maintaining and building up salt marsh elevation. And of course, elevation and the buildup of it is how these marshes are outpacing sea level rise. So let's break this down a little bit further. So when we think about just the above ground parts of Spartina, so the leaves and the stems, when the tide comes in, it brings a series of sediments. And those leaves and stems of Spartina catch and trap that sediment and make it settle to the surface of the marsh. This helps the marsh grow or build up in elevation. When we think about below ground, as Spartina grows, those roots and rhizomes of the plants grow and expand and take up more space. This leads to an ultimate expansion of the salt marsh surface. So when we think about these processes combined, both above and below ground, we get a process called vertical accretion, or the physical building up of the marsh. So again, as those sediments settle to the surface and as those roots expand, it increases the elevation of the marsh, and that's what helps it keep pace or outpace sea level rise. And it's important to remember that a marsh's ability to build up ultimately depends on the number and the size of Spartina. So again, if we're relying on Spartina to capture those sediments and bring them to the surface and to grow below ground, the bigger and the more Spartina plants there are, the more buildup that you'll get. So I'll just take a quick question break really quickly here. I know vertical accretion in this process may be a bit complicated. So if I have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them now.
I had a quick question. How tolerant is the Spartina to salt water? I mean, how much salinity can it tolerate?
A ton. So it can go fully saline somewhere around 30 parts per thousand, but we also see it as low as almost fresh water. So one of the main reasons that Spartina grows where it does and is the only plant there is because of its ability to tolerate salinity. So the saltier, the better. It means Spartina gets to expand those roots and take over the entire marsh because nothing else can live in that really salty water.
So it's found kind of the perfect evolutionary niche there for
Absolutely, 100%.
All right. So we do have a question. So what have you observed as the annual vertical accretion rate?
Ooh, so that's a really interesting question. So I personally don't measure vertical accretion, or at least I haven't yet, but we have these really cool instruments. They're called surface elevation tables. And it's this idea that it measures surface accretion over time on really long-term scales. So we typically say that accretion is somewhere between 3 and 5 millimeters a year. And that's right about what we see sea level rises at in our area too. Although where we're at is very unique in that sea level rise is actually rising a bit quicker in our area for a variety of different reasons. But I think somewhere between 3 and 5 millimeters is common. All right, so we just got done talking about how marshes are keeping pace with sea level rise, and that requires a distinct number and bigger plants. So what can decrease the number and size? Well, that would be our grazers or our herbivores. So there are two specific grazers that I'd like to talk about today. The first is the purple marsh crab, pictured here. And the purple marsh crab is a burrowing crab species, and it develops these really extensive burrow networks. You can kind of see some of these openings here. And this crab is able to burrow over a foot down into the ground. And because of that, it forms these really intricate networks where all of the crabs are able to live and escape their predators. Because of their ability to burrow down, it also means that they can eat both the above and the below ground parts of Spartina. And that's illustrated quite well here by a different study where they gave only the above ground parts of Spartina to purple marsh crabs and only the below ground parts. And as you can see, those parts are gone. So that means that the purple marsh crab eats, again, both the above and the below ground parts of Spartina. This can lead to the total removal of Spartina from some areas. Another grazer that I'd like to talk about is the marsh periwinkle, this snail pictured here. And the marsh periwinkle eats Spartina in a very different way than the purple marsh crab. So we not so affectionately refer to these as our fungal farmers. So the periwinkle goes through, and as it climbs on the leaves and the stems of Spartina, it uses its radula, or a very spiky tongue, and will scrape the outside or the inside of these Spartina leaves. That scraping allows fungal infections to enter into Spartina tissues and grow. You can kind of see them in these orange pieces here. After that fungus invades, the marsh periwinkle will come back around to its own personal fungal farm and eat that fungus. It then leads to these scars on the leaves of Spartina where you can see all the way through them. And ultimately, once it's done farming, that leads to plant death. So you can see this plant that has just been farmed on every single leaf that it has. And so the periwinkle's herbivory or grazing is really focused on just the above ground parts of Spartina, which again is different than the purple marsh crab, which eats both above and below. But in many marshes, we find high abundances of both grazers, both the marsh crab and the periwinkle. So you can imagine that when they both go to feed on Spartina, they have a really big impact. In fact, in many of the marshes along our coastline, really intense grazing from both periwinkles and marsh crabs leads to large patches of marsh where all of the vegetation has been completely removed. You can kind of see that here. I think it's important to note that both purple marsh crabs and periwinkle snails are native to our area. They aren't invasive, they haven't been introduced, yet their impacts in these large areas of completely denuded marsh are relatively new. So why are they having such a dramatic impact now? One possible explanation for this is through predator removal, meaning that when we remove the predators of purple marsh crabs and periwinkles, we're potentially increasing their abundance and allowing them to eat through these marshes. And so a quick example of predator removal is something we may be more familiar with that comes out of Yellowstone National Park. So we know in Yellowstone, there's this really interesting food web of gray wolves, which eat white-tailed deer, which eat prairie grasses. Back in the early 1900s, all of those gray wolves were removed from Yellowstone. This led to an overabundance of white-tailed deer, which then dramatically decreased the amount of prairie grass available. This led to a loss of ecosystem services and ultimately an unbalance in this ecosystem. Eventually, the wolves were restored and the balance was also restored. So we know that predators are really important in systems for maintaining those natural balances in food webs. So when we think about predator removal in salt marshes, this ultimately means that declines in predators such as striped bass or blue crabs ultimately lead to increases or overabundances in our herbivores, the purple marsh crab and the periwinkle. This increase in these grazers ultimately leads to a decrease in Spartina biomass. And of course, the decrease in Spartina biomass leads to a decrease in the vertical accretion or the buildup of the marsh. So this may have you a bit sad for a moment, and I don't mean to take you there. I promise there is still good news to this story. So I will say that despite having such high abundances of purple marsh crabs and periwinkles, we still see many marshes that look much like this, lush and green and full of plants. So one question might be why? Why are these marshes persisting despite having such high abundances of herbivores? Well, the good news to my story is that Spartina is capable of defending itself against its grazers. So Spartina can't run away from its grazers, so it has to get a little creative. And when I say creative, I do not mean that Spartina is wielding swords against its herbivores, although that would be quite cool. But there are still several different types of plant defenses. There are some obvious signs. So when we think about plant defense, we may think about things like thorns or spines, something you may see on your rose bush. We also may think about toxic chemicals in plants such as milkweeds. Well, unfortunately, Spartina doesn't have either of these types of defenses, but again, it is not defenseless. So there are several different types of Spartina defenses specifically, but there are three main categories I'd like to introduce to you today. The first is this idea of tissue toughness. So following a grazing event, Spartina is capable of increasing the toughness of its tissues. This would make it tougher or more difficult for an herbivore to tear or bite through a leaf. Another possible mode of defense is increased plant growth. So think about this like the weeds in your garden. You pull one weed and all of a sudden 5 are back in its place. So Spartina can use a similar type of defense. If an herbivore comes and eats one plant or a part of a plant, that plant can increase the number of plants that it grows back in its place. Another possible defense is through alteration of chemical traits. So internally in its leaves and stems, Spartina is capable of altering some of the chemicals that it has that makes that plant less attractive to its herbivores. So if you're a crab roaming through a marsh looking for a great plant to eat, this would be the one you avoid. So the good news is that all three of these types of defense ultimately lead to decreases in herbivory by marsh crabs and periwinkles. And this is, of course, great news for the marsh. But one question you may have is what influences these different defenses? How is Spartina choosing which defense it will use against its herbivores? Well, this is where I come in. A lot of my research is really focused on thinking about how different factors such as salinity or nutrient addition influence these different plant defenses. And for the rest of my talk, I will use this symbol for salinity. It is sodium chloride or salt. So before I dive into some of my specific research, I'll take just one more quick question break before hopping into my specific dissertation research.
How does the plant keep up with sedimentation? So how does it not get covered up? Does the growth rate vary depending on the sedimentation, or how does that work?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think I understand what you're asking. So a lot of the sediment will stick to the plants, specifically to the stems and to the leaves, but that's mostly down closer to the marsh surface. So all of these plants, depending on where you live around here, they can get to be maybe 2 feet tall or a little taller. And so all of that plant is not covered in sediment. It's just the bottom portions.
So I think you're going to cover this one a little bit later on in your presentation, but with the expected rise of sea levels in Virginia, is that going to endanger the salt marshes?
Yes, we can definitely touch on that a bit at the end as well. But yes, the answer is absolutely. So our salt marshes are quite resilient and they're hardy and they are able to grow and maintain their elevations mostly, but there are quite a few things stacked up against them. And again, sea level rise is accelerated in our area, meaning that it is typically faster than the accretion rate of our marshes. So yes, our Virginia marshes are definitely threatened.
I wanted to ask, how affected are the salt marshes by agricultural runoff?
What a great question. They are affected, and that is something I'll touch on in just a minute or two when I bring up nutrient addition.
Had a question about invasive species, Phragmites.
Sure.
Do they compete with the plants that we're talking about here?
No, not typically. So when we think about the elevation of a marsh, we typically think about it as a gradual slope up from the creek all the way to a forest, say. So the Phragmites is much closer on the forest edge than the creek side of things. So Phragmites is definitely a problem and competes with a lot of other salt marsh plants, but we would typically refer to those as the high marsh plants. It also is impeding on forests. Fortunately for Spartina alterniflora, it is down much closer to the creek and typically doesn't suffer from competition with Phragmites. All right, well, so let's hop right back in. So now I'd just like to touch a little bit on the specific research that I am doing for my dissertation. So when I think about these different factors that influence plant defense, both salinity and nutrient addition, let's take these one at a time. So when we think about salinity specifically, I'm thinking about the estuary that is the Chesapeake Bay and all of the tributaries that branch into it. So estuaries specifically have this unique feature where they're fresher at the head, so up at the top of these different tributaries, and saltier at the mouths, so further down here. But we know that sea level rise is ultimately going to make estuaries a bit saltier. So as sea levels rise, we do expect more saline waters to travel up estuary where things used to be fresher. Many of the herbivores I look at, like the purple marsh crab and the periwinkle, are limited by salinity, meaning that they have to have saline waters in order to survive. But as sea level is pushing salinity up into these fresher parts, these herbivores may follow with the saltier water, and that threatens those marshes that live in previously fresher regions. And so the first question of my dissertation was really focused on how increased salinity and simulated herbivory, where I went through with a pair of garden shears and I clipped plants and acted like a purple marsh crab, how these two factors ultimately influence Spartina defense. And here's what I found briefly. So increased salinity led to decreases in tissue toughness and increases in plant growth and had no effects on chemical traits. So when we think about this in context, what this might indicate is that these decreases in tissue toughness ultimately decrease Spartina defense. However, increases in plant growth may ultimately equal increases in marsh buildup, which is good. When we think about simulated herbivory, I found that it had no effect on the tissue toughness, led to decreases in plant growth, and had no effects on the chemical traits of Spartina. So needless to say, simulated herbivory had no effect on Spartina defense, but that decrease in plant growth may ultimately lead to a decrease in marsh buildup. Now that we've briefly touched on salinity, let's talk a little bit about nutrient addition. So nutrient addition or eutrophication is typically seen from things like fertilizers in agricultural fields or through sewage outfalls. And increased nutrients ultimately lead to poor water quality and typically lower oxygen conditions, which is of course really bad for the things that need oxygen underwater. Increased nutrients or eutrophication ultimately can also lead to harmful algal blooms. So this is a photograph taken by a researcher at VIMS of the York River during a major algal bloom. So all of this red patchwork that you see is an algal bloom. So why might I be thinking about nutrient addition for Spartina defense? Well, it turns out that nitrogen, a critical nutrient that comes in with nutrient addition, is really important for many Spartina defenses as well as the growth of Spartina. So thinking about how the addition of that extra nitrogen impacts Spartina is really important. And so the second main question of my dissertation really focused on that idea of nutrient addition and periwinkle herbivory on Spartina defense. And what I found briefly is that increasing nutrient content led to decreases in tissue toughness, increases in plant growth, and decreases in chemical traits. Meaning when there was extra nitrogen around, we actually had declines in Spartina defense, but that increase in plant growth could be good news for marsh buildup. When we think about periwinkles and their herbivory, I found that it increased tissue toughness, decreased plant growth, and increased chemical traits. Meaning that when a periwinkle grazes on a Spartina plant, you actually see an increase in Spartina defense. However, they decreased plant growth, which may ultimately lead to declines in marsh buildup. So when we think about all of these factors together and in summary, we can really group them into two distinct effects. The first is thinking about these human and climate-driven factors. So human being the addition of nutrients and sea level rise potentially increasing salinities. And I found that these two factors both led to declines in Spartina defense, but increased plant growth, which may ultimately increase marsh buildup. It's important to note that some of these results are quite nuanced. So if we think about decreases in Spartina defense, that may ultimately increase the amount of herbivory that we see, which could negate some of the positive effects that we see of plant growth. When we think about grazers specifically, simulated herbivory led to a decrease in plant growth, which may equal a decrease in marsh buildup. Herbivory from periwinkles led to increased Spartina defense, which is great, but a decrease in plant growth, which may ultimately decrease marsh buildup. So again, we see this opposing effect where potentially an increase in Spartina defense may equal a decrease in herbivory, which could potentially negate that decrease in plant growth. So needless to say, it's complicated, but I'm working on it. So this is all part of my dissertation, which is still very much underway. My research is far from complete, but I hope that this has helped you understand a bit about how our natural systems are working and some of the research that's being done to answer these questions. So you may be asking yourself, what can we do? So one main way that we can help our salt marshes is really just by protecting our coastal ecosystems in general. So that can be through reducing and reusing and recycling in our households, so less waste is ultimately ending up in our marshes and other ecosystems. This also includes minimizing or finding alternatives for fertilizers or other high nutrient amendments. When you consider shoreline protection for your home, I hope you'll consider things like living shorelines as opposed to bulkheads or seawalls. So a living shoreline can, of course, increase the amount of salt marsh that we have available and contributes ultimately to the health of our ecosystems. We can also do our part in following fishing and harvesting regulations that are set forth by the Virginia Marine Resources Commission. By following these different rules and regulations, we can help increase the abundance of predators such as blue crabs or striped bass. both of which eat purple marsh crabs and periwinkles. And by increasing the abundance of these predators, we're helping restore that natural balance in those ecosystems. So I bring you back to my original title, How Plants Can Save Our Salt Marshes. I hope you've learned at least a little bit about the different defenses of Spartina and how these defenses ultimately lead to declines in herbivory by grazers like purple marsh crabs and periwinkles. And declines in grazing by these herbivores ultimately leads to an increase in Spartina growth and size. And again, as foundation species, Spartina is critical in maintaining and building up the elevation of our salt marshes. And this is ultimately what will help them keep pace or outpace rising seas. So if you haven't yet today, please thank your local salt marsh plants for all of their hard work. And with that, I would like to just briefly acknowledge my advisor, Dr. David Johnson, and the rest of my lab at VIMS. I'd also like to thank my funding sources for my dissertation, the Garden Club of America, Virginia Sea Grant, and the VIMS Office of Academic Studies. I'd also like to provide you a few brief additional resources if you're interested in learning more. So specifically, if you're interested in learning on how marshes are encroaching on our forests because of sea level rise, there's an excellent art collaborative from the Eastern Shore that is hosting a virtual gallery that you can explore to learn more about ghost forests. If you're interested in learning more about how sea level rise may be impacting you or your neighbors, I encourage you to take a look at the NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer. So using this tool, you can understand a bit more about how quickly sea level is rising and how quickly it's projected to rise, and how this may ultimately affect flooding or storms in your area. And of course, if you're interested in learning more about VIMS and our public events and some of our latest research, I encourage you to subscribe to eTidings, our monthly e-newsletter. And with that, I will take any additional questions.
So in addition to the blue crab and the striped bass, are there any other predators for the purple crabs and the periwinkle?
So great question. So I'm sure that there are other fish species that eat them, but I don't know off the top of my head. So there is some work that has been done in Massachusetts, and that's where we learn a lot about the impacts of striped bass. And I have specifically seen blue crabs crush the shells of periwinkles and eat them. So I'm sure that there are other predators, but I'm not sure what they are.
Okay. So to kind of follow up on that one, is Spartina and the fungus that grow on, is that the only food source for these particular animals, for the periwinkles and the marsh crabs?
So I'll separate those two. So periwinkles are a generalist, meaning that they'll eat anything and everything. So they don't just subsist on the fungus on Spartina. They also will eat diatoms or small phytoplankton that live on the sediment surface of the marsh. So the periwinkle is unique in that at low tide, when the mud is exposed, they'll crawl around the mud and eat whatever they can find. And then at high tide, they crawl up Spartina, and that's probably to avoid things like blue crabs. And so then they'll eat on Spartina. So basically they spend their days eating and they eat whatever they can find. Purple marsh crabs are potentially a little bit different. So I have not personally looked at the diets of them exclusively, but they do mostly eat Spartina. I'm sure that they also will eat some diatoms or other small algae that they find, but the majority of their diet is Spartina.
Okay. So I had a question. Do we see, in response to sea level rise, are the salt marshes moving further inland as well? Is that happening?
If they can, they will. Yes. So we think of how marshes are dealing with sea level rise in two ways. So the first is vertical accretion. Again, this idea of the marsh physically building upward to keep pace with sea level. But if the marsh can, it will move back. So that is marsh transgression. So that's where these ghost forests are coming into play. It's the idea that as sea level is rising, the marsh it brings saltier water further back towards the forest, and the marsh is starting to grow into the forest. However, in places like Willis Wharf, that photograph that I showed you, there's really nowhere for the marsh to go. So if the marsh can't move back, it gets squeezed out, and that is when the ocean meets the community and there is no more salt marsh.
Can you explain the difference between a foundation species and a keystone species?
I can sure try. So I think it depends on who you talk to. But I think of, well, I'm a plant person. So when I think of foundation species, I think of plants, things that, again, without them, the marsh doesn't exist. I guess in this scenario, I would also consider salt marsh plants to be keystone species. However, I don't think that they are always interchangeable. I think they are in this scenario specifically.
So are you aware of any other connection with other invasive species that could affect the salt marsh besides just the other seagrass that we talked about earlier? Snakehead fish is the specific one that was brought up here.
Yeah. So Phragmites was the specific one that was brought up, and Phragmites is definitely a problem in many, many marshes. Again, it doesn't interact so much with Spartina alterniflora, but it does interact with many other salt marsh plants. I know, so not so much in Virginia salt marshes, but up closer to New England, they suffer from an invasion of green crabs. And so green crabs, depending on who you talk to, can be good in that they compete with Sesarma for burrow space. And so Sesarma is the purple marsh crab, sorry. So green crabs will fight the purple crabs and kick them out of their burrows, which could be good news. But green crabs are also highly invasive and they're everywhere. And so that's also not good. There is talk of establishing commercial fisheries for green crabs up on like Prince Edward Island and places like that. But I can't think of any others off the top of my head.
Okay, looks like we've got nothing else in the chat. So we'll go ahead and bring it to a close for today. Thank you all for joining us. Ms. Wittyngham, thank you so much for joining us today. We're very happy to have you. Great presentation. I really enjoyed it. I got great feedback from the audience as well. Next week, please do take note. Lunch Break Science will be at a different time next week. It will be Thursday, December 10th at 10 a.m. The reason for that is because we have the Chief Technologist for NASA, Dr. Douglas Terrier, and he will be discussing the upcoming Artemis mission. So do take note. We expect a great turnout for that one. It will be December 10th at 10 a.m. So it will not be Wednesday at noon next week. You can register for next week's talk at smv.org. Each talk is free to attend and is open to the first 300 registrants. Thank you again for joining us today. Until next week, stay safe and stay curious. Thank you all for coming.